Hey, folks, welcome back to Breakdown, the Poet and the Poems, a show where a poet helps us to break down poetry as inspiration and motivation for our everyday lives. I am your host, Tamara J. Madison, and this episode of Breakdown features none other than the lipstick diva herself, Dr. Tara Betts, and she will be discussing her book, Break the Habit. This episode started off talking about Flavor Flav and Chuck D and Public Enemy, went into love and relationships and separation and divorce, and ended up with a piece that was inspired by Gwendolyn Brooks. So, you know how we do. Join us. Grab your cup of tea, your coffee, your snack, whatever it is you need, and come on over to the breakdown. Okay, welcome, folks, back to Breakdown. I am excited about this episode because I have the lipstick diva herself here with me. Dr. Tara Betts is going to talk to us today about her book, Break the Habit. Break the Habit. And I want to read to you a little bit about her. Dr. Tara Betts is the author of Break the Habit, Arc and Hue, and the forthcoming Refuse to Disappear. In addition to working as an editor, a teaching artist, and a mentor for other writers, she has taught at several universities. She is the inaugural poet for the People Practitioner Fellow at University of Chicago and founder of Whirlwind Learning Center. Welcome, Dr. Betts. May I call you Tara? Is that okay?
That's fine with me, and it's good to see you again, Miss Madison.
It's good to see you. You better not be calling me no Miss Madison on here. You know you better call me.
I do that with kids younger than me too. I'll call them by their last name. Miss such and such, what are you doing?
That gets a little tricky nowadays.
Yeah, you gotta know what their names are.
Yeah, I messed around in the classroom this week and said sir to somebody, and then it hit me. I was like, wait a minute. I hope I wasn't offensive. So, you know, you got to kind of watch out. But it's okay for me. It's okay for me. But please call me Tamara. I always start off by reading what I consider to be my blurb for the book, right? What I started doing was I decided every time I would read a book for this show, I wanted to encapsulate it, find a way to put what my experience with the book was. So this is my blurb assignment. Okay, you ready?
Okay.
Okay. With mentions of Chuck D, Flavor Flav, and Huey Newton in the opening poem, Tara Betts illustrates the quiet courage and ferocity one must have to break the habit, become a revolutionary, and survive beyond the terror dome.
Thank you for that.
So I had to work on that because I was like, I read that first poem and then you took me totally someplace else, right? And I was like, wait a minute, why did she use this as the first poem? But by the time I got to the end, what happened for me was I felt like you had to become your own revolutionary, right? To shift.
Feel like that.
Yeah, to shift and change your life. And I was like, okay, so now I see why that first piece is there. So the first question I have for you, I don't want us to read that poem, but I do want to ask you, what is the terror dome? Define that for people who might not have any idea.
The title of the poem is actually the title of a Public Enemy song. And I mean, when you listen to the song, he's really talking about the repressive kind of colonial state of America. And part of me wanted that subtext in the poem as well, but I'm also thinking about this idea of how the terror dome, it isn't always something violent, right? It's something that's taken away from you and you don't even know it was taken away from you. Like, since you know the poem, you know what happens at the end. It's me as a teenager going to the library and going through all these steps, to find out who is Huey Newton, because he was mentioned in a Public Enemy song and he was mentioned in that one in particular. For me, it was remembering kind of almost feeling like I was betrayed by my education as a young person. Like, why haven't I learned about this? Why has no one taught me? Why did I have to dig? And then I get to hear the same history stories every year that are taught in a way that isn't compelling, doesn't connect the dots, doesn't talk to me as a person in America, who is not one of the presidents, who is not one of the leaders of a military coup or something, So I was just like, yeah, I said, that's another kind of violence too, to not know about yourself, about the history of the people that you come from and that you identify with. So I kind of wanted to talk about that, like those small violences from when you're young. And then the book goes into more of what that's like in a personal relationship and as you become an adult. Um, so I think that's part of it. Like, it's kind of, I wanted that American thing, but then also the thing of what are the small violences we encounter.
That's the perfect segue, because that was where I wanted to go next.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that the small violences are still violent, right? And in the big world, it may be a small violence, but to an individual person, right? It's Mount Everest is huge.
Right.
So where I wanted us to actually go first, the first poem I would like for you to read is Unsteady Directions. Yeah. And the reason why is because I was thinking about what you said about education, the things that we learn, the things that we have to unlearn, the things that we learn, whether they serve us or not. And so I wanted us to actually start with Unsteady Directions. Would you read that for us?
Of course. It's cool. I got it. So let's see. Unsteady Directions. Random improvised directions kept me safe. None are certified, foolproof, impervious. Walk under streetlights or in the middle of the street, never in the shadows, near alleys or dark doorways. Look directly into faces that follow you too closely. Pour drinks into sinks, toilets, plants, out of windows. Keep keys twined between fingers, steel knuckles spiked to greet the tender spaces that should miss your soft. Walk with friends, watch for folds where trust creases. Only wear clothes that allow you to run, kick, or punch. Be able to take down a man. Incapacitate attackers, 1 or 3. If hit, feel the welt rise warm, just once. Even smart women forget this rule when they tuck their joys carelessly into purses, dangle them like precious stones, unaware that thieves make ears ring for the pawn shop. What kept me safe was quiet Fridays with fewer parties. That was no guarantee either. I fought boys fumbling with buttons and an older boy who shoved an ashy branch of fingers into my 7-year-old jeans. My small fist screams in daylight. The threat of my father less than a block away were my repellents. No one warned me about the whispered rumors that I liked it, wanted it. He was not the only one. The murmurs could care less. Master no at the highest volumes possible. Take instructions from men and women that permit all limbs to speak martial fluently. If parents are shields, hold nothing. If parents fail or blame, find a fortress to release whatever wounds. These directions may or may not help. Each step creeps toward what instructions should be. Guidelines, safe keep, uncracked smiles, unbruised kisses, unshaken, steady.
Okay, so you hit me with this as a woman as a mother to a daughter. And it reminded me of, the things that I learned as a child, things like you said that didn't work,
Mm-hmm.
as well as the things that I needed to teach my daughter that did and didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that in itself, everything that you just read, the simple fact that it had to be written and that those are the lessons that have to be shared. The reason why that has to be shared is because being in this body, we have our own pterodome to deal with.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I was just having that conversation actually in the last breakdown with Ramika. And she said, how long are we going to allow certain violences and things like that against women and their bodies?
Mm-hmm.
So what provoked you to write that piece?
Well, I have to say, I wrote that poem because um, the part about when I was a young person, I might not have been 7. I was definitely old enough to ride my bike. That part actually happened. And I never wrote about it. I just never wrote about it. Not that I was ashamed or anything like that. I just never felt like it was, especially when I've heard so many other really egregious and horrible things. And I kind of minimized it in my head, like, that's not that important. I know a lot of women who have been through so much worse, a lot of people, period, who have been through so much worse. So I just didn't think I had much to say in that conversation except to be a supportive person. And then I kept thinking about it and I said, well, wait a second. I don't like going out at night. I don't like, I do certain things like, and I caught myself giving those instructions to myself and I just started writing them down. And I thought about it because I think at the time my friend Nikki Patan was doing a lot of work in Chicago with starting Surviving the Mic, which is a circle particularly for writers who are survivors of sexual assault. And then also, I think Mahogany Brown was working on a project. So I wrote this poem and I said, maybe it's time to write about it because it's got me thinking about it, you know? And I said, I wanted to write something that was very straight up. Like, it's like almost like somebody talking. And it's so weird. I was just teaching Jamaica Kincaid's story Girl, which if any of your listeners or watchers go and you can Google it, it's all online and it's like a page long, but it's in the voice of the mother telling the girl everything she needs to do to be a good girl, basically, and not the slut upon which you are so bent becoming. Like she keeps saying that, and I was like, how many times do we have that person in our head giving us directions, or there's some entity that has been feeding us these sorts of instructions and directions the whole time, and then we've internalized it. So I'm like, yeah, I think it might be time to write this poem, and I encourage a lot of writers to do that too, like as a first time writing exercise. you know think about somebody who taught you a lesson and how did they tell it to you. Write it in the way they would say it to you.
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
know
I know the first time I read that piece by Jamaica Kincaid, I was a grown woman, but my feelings were hurt.
right, you feel
I
like
was just like, whoa,
you
whoa.
felt
And
red, didn't you?
yes. And she said slut just way too many times for me, right? And I'm
Right.
standing in the classroom trying to talk about the piece. And I had one student raise his hand and he was like, yo, miss, but where I come from, that's normal. And he was from the Caribbean.
Right.
Right. And so then we had this conversation about the cultural context of how those stories are told. Because I was thinking I would talk to my daughter about some of these things, but not in that kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought that, woo, and it did provoke me to actually write something. But it's interesting because one of the things that came up in the classroom that I also shared with Ramika was that it occurred to me one day that when a woman goes out on a date, when a man goes out on a date, it's an adventure or maybe a break from boredom, right? To me, when a woman goes out on the date, it might be an adventure, but in the back of her mind, she always knows it's a risk.
Yeah.
And that's how we're raised. We don't talk about that or anything like that, but we're raised that, you know, you don't even have to go out the door, but it's a risk just because you're in this body. But what's so amazing is we still take that chance on loving anyway. We still try to have relationships. We still try to get in, you know what I mean? And we still haven't given up on relationships. So you know where I want you to go next, right?
Oh dear. You let me know. Let me know.
I need you to turn to page 20 and read this poem for me. I'm not even going to tell you what it is.
Oh.
This was the sexiest little thing. And I was like, oh, right? And to me, it's really beautiful that the person that wrote that other poem could also write this one. So would you read La Guitarra for us, please? Okay. And I don't usually do this, but I want you to read the two of them back to back. Ooh. And we're going to go, yeah. And then we're going to go into further discussion.
Okay. I'm down for that.
All right.
La Guitarra. When he was still promising children, you had so many nicknames, a sea of monikers like colorful glass beads strung together, dipped in jasmine oil. You were Cookie, Honey, Baby, Wife, Love, Beautiful, names we all know. But the last name came from his parents' tongue, La, forged in the short song of an article, then the hard G, pulling the lips back, then falling into Tara, with two hard rolling R's like bottleneck pressed into frets when chords never relent. La guitarra. He named your body instrument shaped like songs uncles plucked from veneer, with long thin neck and narrow waist set against full chest and wide hips reverberating near his leg. He held you close then, palm pressed on navel, where your strings might be. Then that was the only lullaby that you would ever need. In the poem on page 20, Finding Who You Lost. I don't know when I started to lose myself. The slip downward was moving into his parents' house, a crumbling cliff in suburbia, far from literary city pretend. Or was it when I brought him mango chunks in a stifling third floor walk up in Bed-Stuy, and he first mentioned marriage and children? He kept handling these words to me like loaves of bread still warm from some bakery oven close to his eyes. I lost myself in increments, smaller, less visible than inches, when I began to outgrow clothes and wondered why swelling would not shrink with exercise. Degrees of me ebbed away. He said, "You do not need a new job, a PhD, a side job." Congestion flooded my lungs, and the doctor said, "You are not sick." Diabetes hummed and waited to collide with insulin. He ignored my pleas to go for walks with me. I lost fragments of myself when I waited. My wingspan should have spread wide, glided fast and far from his thoughts, anchoring me.
So we go from that warm, intimate, close, sexy, we are one space, to little by little by little, like you said, in increments, we lose ourselves. And so the first thing that I wrote in this book, because I take notes in my book, the first thing I wrote was, this happens to all of us. I really do believe this happens to all of us. Yeah. And I think for the people who say it doesn't happen to them, I don't think that they've checked the increments well enough.
Yeah. And it's hard. I haven't really read, there's certain poems I read from this book, and I haven't, you're picking all the poems I typically don't read. Probably because it makes me think about that in a way. And I think it doesn't just happen to women. One, I want to say that.
Okay.
Whenever you're in a long-term relationship, we all make compromises, we all make sacrifices. And we change because of that, right? We change. And sometimes it is for the better, sometimes it is not.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's just like destructive in a way that like just hollows you out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why so many people, you know, they talk about the 7-year itch, or people are just like shy of commitment now. I think that's part of it. I think part of us are really afraid that we're going to miss something if we change in this relationship to accommodate another person, you know.
Mm-hmm. And
And
I think sometimes we do. I think sometimes we do. And that change works. And then there are other times when it doesn't.
right.
And that's the tricky part. It's like, is this change good for me? Or am
Mhm.
I losing something that I'm going to wish I had later?
Right.
That's that tricky part, right?
Right.
And it's tough because you don't know, because when you're being played like a guitar and the music is so sweet, you know what I mean, you have
Mhm.
no idea where it's going to go from there. And it's not even on purpose. You know, a lot of the time it's not something that somebody set out doing to you or that you set out doing to someone else,
Mhm.
but it's risky.
Yeah. And
It's
just the,
really risky.
and it makes me think about what you said earlier, like we still keep trying though. And I
Mhm.
guess it's because we're imbued with this thing that says, you know, that's a human need to feel something, to want to have a close relationship with another person.
Mhm.
So you take the risk knowing that, you know, what's the quote? You say it's better to have loved and lost than to never have loved at all.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
know,
Mhm. I think I learned at a fairly early age that instead of, how do I want to say this tactfully? Instead of always putting my trust and expectation into someone else, I had to put more of my eggs in the basket that said that no matter what happens, I can trust that I will recover. You feel what I'm saying? It's like I understood that they were two totally different things and that it worked both ways. Not always that somebody was going to disappoint me, but that I could also disappoint someone who had
right.
certain trust and expectation of me. And so, what we really have to trust is that no matter what happens, we're going to be able to survive or get through it. You know, if it doesn't turn out the way we thought. And so when I read this piece, I was like, oh, it turned. And there was such a sweetness in that first piece. But what really got me, we have to go here next.
Uh-oh.
What really got me, damn it, what really got me was the machete.
Oh man. I
And the wild part is the piece says the machete. So I'm like, okay, I'm ready. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, okay, we going, and then I read the piece and I'm like, it goes there. So would you read that piece for us?
yeah, I just want to say too, um, a lot of this book was written right after my divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to capture the things that made me get married in the first place too. Because I think that's important. It's like people get married for a reason. You obviously care about this person, or you love them, or there were things about them that made them sparkle to you and maybe nobody else in the same way, right? So to just be mad and write those pieces, like everybody has a piece to write when they need to rant about how things didn't work out. But do you have the space where you can say, okay, why was I here in the first place?
Okay, I got to stop you right there because I have to tell you that that came up for me as I was reading the book. When
Good.
I started moving
Wanted.
through the more painful places, I
Mhm.
was like, how did she manage to remember? Because so often we forget so often the pain takes up so much space and so much room and is so dramatic and so relentless that we forget that. So that was one of the questions that I had for you. How did you manage to hold on to a couple of pearls?
You know, I think I read a couple of really interesting books around the time because I did the thing that people tell you you're not supposed to do, which is read other books that talk about the same thing. And I was so so glad that I did.
So you read books about divorce?
Yeah. And it wasn't, they were poetry books now. I think it was Stag's Leap by Sharon Olds. Um, I think it's Blowback by Denise Duhamel. And January Gill's book, I think it's called Afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought a lot about how I usually approach a poem and how Marilyn Hacker talked about when she wrote Winter Numbers, which is her book of poems all about the AIDS crisis and how she lost all these friends. And one of the things that she said was, is that the only way she could write about all that tragedy without sounding like a cliche was to write in form and control it that way. Mm-hmm. So my way of controlling wasn't form at all. It was more so, what are the tender and really beautiful moments that I'm grieving for? Mm-hmm. Like, what are the things that, it was like this little brushstroke that encapsulated things that, I mean, there are plenty of things that didn't make it into the book that could have been poems, mm-hmm. but I tried to capture the ones that seemed the most coherent to me.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And let me tell you why. And I really have to commend you for this, right? Because I remember doing the same thing with my divorce. I remember thinking to myself, okay, regardless as to how crazy and how nasty this may have gotten, I've got to make sure that I have one pearl, that's what I called it, one pearl that I buff and shine to remember why I got with this person in the first place. Right. But the reason why I did it was because it was my baby's dad. Right. Mm-hmm. And I felt like it was important for me to hold on to that beauty of him so that I could share that with them, you know, whenever it was needed. And so that's why I say I really have to commend you for this, because you didn't do it for anybody else. You knew that you needed to do it for yourself. Now I realize so many years later that I did it for me too, and probably for me more than the children, but they were there as my catalyst. They were there as my jumpstart, whatever. You did this of your own initiative. There was something in you that said, wait a minute, I wasn't crazy. I didn't do this for no reason at all. So I've got to put that in the forefront and remember, and that's a lot. That's a whole lot. And we forget that too easily.
No. And I think too, other than I was grieving when I wrote it, it's like now looking back at it, I can be like, okay, I remember doing this little ritual where it was like, I forgave my ex. And then I started to think about it like, okay, what do I need to be forgiven for? Because I'm never going to get that closure, right? And I intentionally said, look, I don't need to communicate with this person. I don't have to raise kids with them, but I also don't have to carry that around anymore. You know? And it's been hard. I mean, there are some things I wish had turned out differently, but I think, you know, writing the book was really helpful in terms of processing a lot of that and just feeling like I could move forward because I couldn't write about anything else. It's like I was trying to write about other stuff, and it wouldn't come until after this book had been in print. Like I wrote some smaller things, like I was writing quantibus and I started writing book reviews again and stuff like that. But it wasn't the poems. The poems just kind of locked in on that.
They were
And,
your medicine.
yeah.
They
And
were
I
your
think,
medicine.
and I think sometimes we forget that's what poems do. We're in a really interesting period where I think there's formal diversity, where people are reinventing the sonnet and creating new types of poetic forms, and people are making these visual poems. But I'm like, yo, I wanted to write poems that talked about things that touched people that I knew who might never pick up a poetry book. Like, this book was dedicated to my mom, and unfortunately it came out after she passed. But
Oh, wow.
she knew about it. I'm sure she probably saw a few of the poems. And it's probably the one book that I can say is closest to our experiences as adult women. Because my mom was, I'm sorry, I've just had this weird cough.
No, I'm glad you called because I want to stop you because I don't want you to go to your mom yet.
Okay.
Because we're going to get there, because that whole idea of how we mirror our mothers, we're going to get there. But I do want you to read the machete for me.
Of course.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I just want to let anybody who sees this later know this was the poem that really made me mad. This one right here really made me mad. Go ahead.
I still miss it, just so you know. Like, there's every once in a while I'm like that was mine. Anyway, it'll make sense once I read the poem, y'all, whoever's watching. The machete. All of his daughters had machetes, not guns, but wide blades, meant to cut sugarcane, thick stalks that grow in Cayenne, the Cuban town that he will never see again. His eyes brightened when he insisted on this gift. His son gave me a ring. My father-in-law would have to give me the blade with the long handle, since I would be the new daughter. When I returned to visit, his stifled snickers were barely contained as he revealed the gleaming metal in the dim living room. My own machete is not the exclamation that one expects from a new wife. When the new husband left, he took most of his clothes while I was out of town, and he took the machete, my one defense against intruders in a first floor apartment with sliding glass doors. My machete, the one gift that said, "You are my daughter." So
that piece really got to me because earlier, you hint at your strained relationship with your biological father. And so it made me think about how this was not just a wedding gift for you, because you end the poem with the word daughter.
Yeah.
And how this gift, and I was thinking too about how perhaps this man was able to give you things that your own biological father could not. Mm-hmm. And this dude has the nerve to take it. I was so offended. My heart was hurt. I was like, it hurt. And I think I would have written a whole bunch of machete poems after that, because it was just, like I said, it was just so offensive to me. And because, I read, there's the poem about the wedding dress. The wedding dress went in the garbage, right?
Yeah, in the poem it does.
Right. Yeah. In the poem, it goes in the garbage, and all of these things that you're letting go, and that one thing that you want to keep, as well as a thing that you can use to protect yourself. He walks out the door with it. I gotta ask, did you ever ask for it back?
I asked why it was taken. I didn't get a comprehensive answer. And I was told that I was scary.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that I thought was he had to take it because he thought she would cut his ass. That was one of the things that crossed my mind.
Well,
right?
I mean, by that point I had also taught in jail, and I was, my retort was I have no desire to go to prison without my choice. So I'll just say that, and
So
that no
what
one
did
is worth going to prison.
so before this, I told you what the machete meant to me. What did the machete mean to you?
Well, I mean, for me, because my ex-father-in-law was born and raised in Cuba. I've been to Cuba. My first godson is from Cuba. So that place holds some kind of resonance for me. Like if I could go back, I would probably go there all the time, but I don't have direct blood kin there, so I can't. But it's probably the one country that if I had a choice, I would try to go back all the time. And so for me, it was kind of like this little cultural bond, but also I felt that, you know, the father in the poem and in real life was very tender and very sweet.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he could be, grouchy like anybody else's dad, but, he clearly was like still infatuated with his wife decades later,
Oh.
There were all these things about him that were really admirable. And I wanted to capture that I missed that too. Right. And,
It's interesting because I thought about the line from Intisake Shange's For Colored Girls, where I think it's the lady in green who talks about somebody walked off with all of my stuff. And there's a line in there where she says, stealing my stuff don't make it yours,
that
makes it stolen, right? And that was what I thought about after I finished reading this piece. I was like, what did you really think that you were going to be able to do with it? Because I felt that in the poem. I felt all of that endearment and all of that tenderness that was reached out to you, right? Don't nobody get to just walk off with that and really be able to do something to it. The other thing that I thought was really just really tender about this piece for me is that he gave you that gift and extended it across cultures. Right? Because a lot of the time when there are mixed marriages between cultures and things like that, languages and all of that kind of stuff, people are like, okay, you know what I'm saying? You have a particular place. But this to me was like a pulling you all the way in. And I just thought it was so tender. And it just messed with me. It just broke my heart.
Yeah. I've thought about that a lot too. Like what that means to be a writer who's in a cross-cultural relationship, right? Mm-hmm. Like, what does that mean? Because I grew up as a kid who was, I had a white mother and a black father. So I've written about that sometimes, and people act like you're not supposed to write about that, but I'm supposed to write about being black all the time. And I'm like, yeah, write about being black with a white mother who's the only white person in the black neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Like be honest about that, because I know when I go out in the world, I'm the same color as my mom. I have the same hair texture as my mom. Mm-hmm. So it's not going to be the same experience like what you might have or what somebody else who may even be even darker than us would experience in the world. We know that colorism is real. Mm-hmm. And light skin privilege is real and racism is real. So for me to act like this is the same in every situation, that's a falsehood. Mm-mm.
Yeah, that wouldn't work at all. It wouldn't work at all. And I think when you try to sidestep that, it takes something away from the poetry.
It does.
You rip at the heart and stab at the heart of the poem itself if you're not being true to what all of those things are. So I wanna move forward, and I have to tell you, you're a problem child for me. Because usually when I'm in this little process, right, I'm like, okay, just 3 to 4 poems. Let me choose this one and this one. I sat down and I had so many poems marked that I wanted us to read and talk about there is orgasm, and there's all of these other poems that I just really wanted to deal with. And I was like, damn it, Tara. And then I was like, then I had to whittle it down, right?
I'm happy to be a problem
So that,
child in
and
that
that's
instance.
wonderful. That is actually wonderful. But what I want to do is go to this thing about the spider. Okay, we need to go to the spider.
Oh dear.
And I was like, this chick got the nerve to open up with Public Enemy, take me through this romance, and then this bitter divorce, and then come back with an orgasm. Yes, that's exactly what I said. That's what you'll find in her book. Come back with an orgasm, like we just said. We live in these bodies and in this world,
Yes,
and have our tarragon, but we always try to get some love and make some connections some kind of way, right?
Yeah.
And then we with the spider, I'm like, hold on. And the spider is on the cover of all things, right?
Yeah.
So I would like for you to read Dragline. Yes, I would like for you to read Dragline. We're not going to read all the spider poems, but
yeah,
I want you to go to Dragline, and we're going to talk about the spider. Let's okay?
Dragline. A spider does not differ from other women. Silk unfurls around her, faintly coated in her scent. That draws them, fills dreams with ripping the lines that frame her limbs in a frame she creates. They watch her ripen into swelled sack of eggs and silk spun around her balanced body until one male studies her lines, symmetry, a growing net flirting in the afternoon sun until he pulls frayed and fragmented strands into flattened strings that catch no wind and clump into hanging rubble. She is not the first woman to lose canvas or poem that came freely. They know she must submit or life stops then and there. She bundles him in honeyed hormones and death if he fails to pluck the thread of courtship or jump dance just so, just long enough to spark new lives in her and leave her to start a new trail of nesting angles beneath her nimble limbs. And we believe this is natural.
Okay, all right. So talk to me about the last line, please. Where did that come from? I'm like, I'm struggling with the last line.
The last line, really what I wanted the spider to do. The spider is kind of like me struggling with my isolation so much that I befriended a spider. But then also this idea, like when I started to read about spiders and study like nature documentaries and how they move and how they behave, even in their relationships, they're predatory. And then I said, well, hell, how different is that from human beings? There are human beings who come to a relationship for like something that is symbiotic or to build a community. But some people in relationships are spiders, or sometimes we act like spiders. We are brutal to each other in relationships. And I said, hell, that's not really different when we hurt each other, you know? And it was just really funny. I remember thinking a lot about, as I was finishing the book, as you can tell, I was struggling with the ending. And then the spider came up. So I had this spider, a garden spider that was on my front porch that was so big, I refused to kill it since it was outside. And I just gave it a name and I called it Craig. So I would look for Craig outside and I was just like thinking about that the whole time. I was like, yeah, spiders aren't that different from people. And then I just started reading about entomology and stuff and how, thinking about Lucille Clifton's The Terrible Stories, where there was a fox that recurred throughout the book. And she actually had a fox that was on her porch. And it would come to her porch the same time every day. And so then I said, oh my God, what if Craig is my fox?
Mm-hmm.
So I just started kind of like thinking, what do spiders mean for me?
It's interesting because one of the things that I was thinking as you were just now speaking about how we can be so mean to each other, there's a quiet voice in the back of our head. You know, a man will hurt you. So you better be ready, right? There's a quiet voice in the back of many men's heads. You know, she gonna hurt you. So you better play her first. There's like this little bitty quiet undercurrent that is very, very powerful that we have
Right.
in relationships. And we say that we don't believe in them because this is the right person and this is the right, all of that kind of stuff, therapy and all these other, but there's still that little undercurrent, which is why we are taught those things that you were talking about in the poem in the first place, right?
Right.
And then, like you said at the end of the poem, and we believe this to be natural.
Right.
Our distrust, our having to be guarded with one another, we believe that to be natural. And it's hard to imagine any place or any time in the world where that was not the case, unless you happen to grow up in some kind of utopian, indigenous something that's so far away that nobody remembers it anymore.
Right. And I wanted to do that poem in such a way that it shows that even in that binary between spiders, it's like both can hurt the other.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes somebody can be more brutal. A female spider will eat a male spider.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a tearing down of everything that she's created as somebody who's an engineer of webs. It's like, no, somebody could get eaten. And we may not do that in human life, but we find ways to brutalize each other nonetheless.
I don't know about that. I don't know, because there are too many instances where a person will consume another person, like drain them dry of everything they got. And that there's not too much of a difference. That's why we have the words vampiric. You know what I mean?
And just cannibal.
And suck all the life out of them, but you survived. You survived. And I was thinking to myself, the irony in the book is we fall in love with someone that we think we can trust and that will protect us and that will provide and all of these other things, right? Mm-hmm. And very often that just does not work the way that we had planned. And how life has a way of showing you the thing that you least expect, that gives you more than you ever dreamed, because it's actually the spider, you know what I'm saying, that becomes like this thing that teaches you all of this wisdom, or that you connect with, right, in a healthy way, to be able to propel yourself and move yourself forward. And that's what I was talking about in the blurb that I did for the book. This journey to come out of that pain was your own personal revolution, that thing that you had to do for yourself. And the proof in the pudding of that for me is Go. Will you read Go for us, please?
Sure. It's the last poem in the book.
It's the very last one on page.
And it's Golden Shovel. So the lines that are on the end on this side, they spell out a line from Gwendolyn Brooks' poem Old Mary. And that line is, my last offense is the present tense. It little hurts me now to know I shall not go. So if you just read it down.
Oh, wow. Wait, I have to write that down.
After Gwendolyn Brooks' Old Mary. If you examine the embers of my life, they will be burned to the last. If anything is worth loving, defense rings its resonant siren. Weaponry is an option that boldly blacksmiths the tender blooming sprout of the present. I seek methods to fortify a steely tense because the heart requires smelting. It wavers in the hungry yellow tongues, little strong licks of heat that echo so many hurts. I cannot deny what rocked and kept me, what once made me feel safe, gone now. Ashes, dust, burned, singed, blown to a language that wind and soil must know. This wild whisper runs inside me, and I must answer it, or the rustling of skin shall molt what is left. I will never, I will not allow myself to live half a life, so I must go.
You know, I don't know if you notice it or not, but, or at least my perception. When I asked you to read La Guitarra, you read it like a footnote. And I'm saying footnote because in the piece, acupuncture, I think it was, your last two lines are, after the last needle was drawn, I knew people could be footnotes or pain. And I marked that on that poem, right? And so when I asked you to read La Guitarra, I was like, oh, she's reading this like a footnote, and rightfully so. But when you read Go, you felt illuminated to me. Go does not feel like a footnote. It feels like you enveloped and swimming in your, or dancing in your own aura. It didn't feel like La Guitarra. And I was like, and that makes perfect sense because she has healed from that space, you know?
I wanted to write something like with some uplift in it too, though. Right? Like there's a lot of really sad, difficult poems in this book, like things I don't normally talk about. And I said, you know, I've talked with some other poets like Nate Marshall and other folks about we need poems that have some joy. We need poems that have some affirmation. We need poems that celebrate our little victories and our big ones, right? And I think that's something, like I was teaching Kevin Young's African American Poetry Anthology. I think it's 200 Years of Struggle is the name of it. And even if we look at the poems that started during slavery, during Jim Crow, during civil rights movement, there's this recurring thread that we find something to latch onto that is like, we made it through this, we made it to this, we accomplished this. And I think that's what a lot of people look for in a poem. They don't look for us to be our little emo, vulnerable selves. They're looking for
the crossover.
Yeah, or they're looking for something that's going like if we think about the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, that was a poem by James Weldon Johnson. And we all know that, well, we don't all know that, but those who know and draw a lot of solace from that, as a song and a poem. And I think that's the thing that I, even when I teach writing or when I read a book, I look for that. Is there gravity and levity? Is there weight and light? What's going on so we feel like there's some balance or there's some distance that's been traveled as we read. And I feel like that was it. Like you hit that last page, it's time to go. You better do something,
And that piece, though, for me, it wasn't just about being uplifted and joy. It was also about courage, because your last three words are, I must go. And think about how many of us don't go because we're afraid, because of our fears of the unknown, because
Right.
of what other people might think, because of what my partner might say. Will it cause too much different distance between me and my partner if I go? Will they think I shouldn't be there because of my age, my size, my color, or whatever? But you end the piece with, I must go. So not only is this piece for me a celebration, but it is also an illustration of your courage. And that's what I meant in the blurb when I said that quiet courage and ferocity. You're not doing a lot of screaming and yelling and cussing in this book, even though you rightfully could, as far as I'm concerned, right? You're not doing a lot of that. You're doing a lot of that much, much deeper
Thank you.
work that has to be quiet, right? Because if you're making too much noise, you're not going to be getting the work done. You're doing that really, really much deeper work that makes you a better human being to whoever and whatever you choose to align with as you move forward, whether it's your students, a new partner, or whatever. And it's that quiet thing. And that, to me, even the relationship with the spider, it's a quiet thing, but it was real intense. And you reflect that very, very well in this book. And it's interesting to me how much more, ooh, I think I felt and I saw reading it this time, because I read it a few years ago, right? Like maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And of course, I ended up giving it to one of my students because I love to give my students books, and I had to reorder it again. But when I read it this time, I'm like, yeah. And I think it's because in this set of years, because of the work that I've done, it helped me to see even more inside the book. So thank you, Dr. Betts.
Thank you. And I'm glad I got to talk about it with somebody who sees that kind of level of in the work, because I think sometimes we look at a lot of poetry books now and they're still kind of dealing with things that are very much in the space of what we deal with as a young person, right? In terms of identity politics, in terms of, railing against the system, and all of those things are important. I still write those poems, right? And I'm looking for ways to make them more nuanced, more complicated. I love the type of work Jeanette Smith has been doing with their poems. I was just reading Gumbo Yaya by Oriel Marie, which is really wonderful. Destiny Birdsong. Like there's so many wonderful poets who I think are hitting that in a different kind of way. Um, but I wanted to go more personal and think about, you know, kind of what I call grown ass problems. Like it's like you may have all of this systemic stuff that's challenging you from the external world, but what happens when all of that stuff starts to fall away, or it becomes more complex and layers upon your relationships, your family, the vulnerability you experience as you age, like all of those different things, and you see the world differently. You just do. Like I don't think I could write the same poems I wrote in my 20s and 30s, and nor would I want to, because I'm not that person anymore, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And, there's plenty of 20 and 30-year-olds who can write those poems too, and probably much more and better. So why would I do that?
Mm-hmm.
Write where you are, and what's the thing you gotta write will come out.
Mm-hmm. Right where you are, and the thing you gotta write will come out. Yeah, that's a good closing note. That's a good closing note, because I wasn't thinking of it that articulately. I was just thinking about what old folks used to say: handle your square. That's what they, you know what I mean? Like just handle your
Stay on
square.
your square. Yep.
Exactly, handle your square. Oh my goodness, this has been so wonderful. Thank you for being a guest. Thank you for enlightening us with your wisdom. Thank you for traveling back to those places where you hurt and bringing us forward into the light of who you are right now, because that takes a lot. That takes a whole lot. And thank you for being so gracious.
This was wonderful. It was such a thoughtful conversation. And I'm really excited about Refuse to Disappear because it's a much happier book.
You know what? And it was interesting to me because when I saw that that was your new book, I was like, oh, of course. Because if you look at the end of the poem that you just read, it makes sense that you would go into that space. So when's it coming out?
It'll be out at the end of June 2022.
The end of June 2022. And the press is, again?
WordWorks Books.
Okay, WordWorks Books. All right. So folks, be on the lookout. Dr. Betts has a brand new book coming out about the light of herself. Let's put it that way.
And many other women.
For me?
And many other women.
Yes, yes, yes. And so it will be coming out in June. We will have her bio and everything like that down in the description below the video. And please, 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 this is a voluntary effort by poets. So please check out their websites, buy their books, show up at their online in-person poetry readings, maybe do a workshop or two, and show your love for the poet and for the poems. Stay tuned for the next episode of Break Down the Poet and the Poems.